I never thought much about moving to a house by the canal. Sure, it seemed peaceful, and having the convenience of docking my boat right in my backyard was a huge plus. The house itself was modest, but the view was stunning. The calm water stretched out before me, shimmering under the sunlight. It was quiet, tranquil even, with just the soft sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But there was one thing about my new home that bothered me, and I didn't realize how much it would until it was too late. Right across the canal was another house, and it couldn't have been more different from mine. The place was a wreck, weathered wood, broken windows, and an air of abandonment. The roof sagged in places, and the yard was overgrown with weeds, the fence barely standing. I could see it perfectly from my kitchen window, an eyesore that contrasted sharply with the beauty around me. I tried to ignore it at first, figuring it was just another rundown property left to rot. Maybe it was a vacation home that someone stopped caring about, or maybe the owners had moved away and hadn't found a buyer. It didn't seem like anyone lived there. The house was always dark, not a single light in sight, and there was no sign of life, no car in the driveway, no movement behind the curtains, nothing. For the first few weeks, I enjoyed the solitude. I'd sit on my deck in the evenings, watching the sun set over the water, the sky painted with oranges and purples. But then I noticed something unsettling. One night, as I was doing the dishes after dinner, I glanced up at the house across the canal. And there, in the window, was a figure. A man, standing motionless, staring directly at me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my eyes playing games with me after a long day. But when I looked again, he was still there. His silhouette was unmistakable, a man in his 50s, with graying hair and a slight hunch to his shoulders. He was dressed simply, dark pants and a long-sleeved shirt, but it was his stillness that unnerved me the most. He just stood there, staring. I turned off the kitchen light, trying to see better without the glare from inside reflecting off the window. When I looked again, the man was gone. My heart was pounding, but I convinced myself that it was no big deal. Maybe he was just looking out his window, the same way I sometimes did. I tried to shake it off, but a nagging feeling of unease settled over me. The next few nights, I couldn't help but glance at the house, and every time I did, there he was, standing in the same spot, watching. Always at the same time, just as dusk was falling, when the light was dim enough that you couldn't be sure what you were seeing, but bright enough to make out the shape of a person. I started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched constantly. It wasn't just an innocent glance out the window anymore. This man, whoever he was staring at me, intently. Even when I tried to pretend I wasn't noticing him, it felt like his eyes followed me wherever I went. One evening, I turned off all the lights in my house, hoping to catch him off guard. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds, barely breathing. He was still there, standing in the same place, his face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the blinds shut and decided to ignore him. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he didn't even know I was watching him back. But deep down, I knew something was off. The breaking point came about a week later. I had just gone to bed, finally feeling a bit more at ease after a few nights without seeing the man. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a soft thud, like someone stepping onto the wooden deck outside. My heart stopped. I held my breath, listening intently, straining to hear any other sound. Then came the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I shot out of bed, heart racing. It was coming from the kitchen. I grabbed my phone and ran downstairs, adrenaline surging through me. When I reached the kitchen, my blood ran cold. The window above the sink was smashed, shards of glass glittering on the floor. A brick lay in the middle of the mess, surrounded by broken dishes and shattered glass. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, trying to explain to the operator what had happened. I told them about the man across the canal, how I had seen him watching me for days, and now this. They promised to send someone right away, but those minutes waiting for the police felt like hours. When they arrived, I led them to the broken window and explained everything again. I pointed across the canal, telling them that the man in the house opposite must have been the one who threw the brick. But when the officers checked, they told me something that made my skin crawl. The house across the canal was empty. Not just unoccupied, but officially vacant. It had been foreclosed months ago, and no one had lived there since. The officers even went inside to check, and they found nothing. No furniture, no personal belongings, and certainly no strange man standing in the window. They assured me that I was probably just mistaken, that it could have been a homeless person or a prankster. But I wasn't convinced. I could feel the weight of their skepticism as they suggested I install some cameras around the property for peace of mind. One of them stayed outside in the patrol car for a few hours, but eventually, even he left, and I was alone again, alone with the broken window and the unsettling knowledge that the man across the canal wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stop thinking about that house, about the man I had seen night after night. Something wasn't right, and I needed answers. So, against my better judgment, I crossed the canal and made my way to the abandoned house. The back door was unlocked, creaking as I pushed it open. The air inside was musty, stale from months, maybe years, of neglect. Dust covered every surface, and the wooden floors groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making your ears ring. I walked through the kitchen and into the living room, my footsteps slow and cautious. The place was completely empty, just like the cops had said. No furniture, no signs of life. But as I ventured deeper into the house, I heard something that made my blood freeze, a faint creaking sound, like someone moving upstairs. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave and never come back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was up there. I took a deep breath and made my way to the staircase. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the old wood groaning beneath my feet. When I reached the top, I could see down the hallway, the doors to the bedrooms open, revealing more empty spaces. But at the end of the hall, one door was closed. The creaking sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from behind that door. I took a step toward it, then another. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before twisting it and pushing the door open. The room was empty. But the window was open, curtains billowing softly in the breeze. I stepped closer, peering out into the backyard below. There was no one there, no sign of the man I had seen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned and left the house, my heart racing, my skin crawling. I locked the door behind me, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Back at my house, I installed the cameras as the police had suggested, hoping they would catch something, anything, that could explain what had been happening. For weeks after that, I didn't see the man again. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, and no more bricks came through my windows. But the unease never went away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me from the shadows. Even now, as I sit here, telling you this story, I can't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see him standing there again, staring back at me. It's crazy how life can shift from feeling safe and predictable to absolute terror in an instant. I never thought I'd be one of those people with a story like this. But here I am, still trying to process it all. I grew up in a small suburban neighborhood, not too far from where I live now. My parents' house was always busy, especially at night because my dad was an insomniac. Every night, like clockwork, he'd be walking up and down the stairs, getting water or heading to the bathroom. I can't count the number of times his footsteps woke me up. It became such a regular part of my life that I started to associate those sounds with comfort in a weird way. I figured I'd be able to sleep better once I got my own place, though, away from all that noise. I moved out of my parents' place in July 2022, finally buying my first house at the age of 28. It was a big step, but one I was proud of. The house was perfect. A 2-story place with a small unfinished basement that had a laundry area and boiler room, A first floor with a cozy living room, kitchen, bathroom, and dining room, and an upstairs with 3 bedrooms. I used one of the bedrooms as my office since I worked from home, another as a small workout room, and the third as my own space. I was pretty excited to have my own setup, and the idea of having a quiet, peaceful night's sleep without my dad's footsteps constantly waking me was something I'd been looking forward to. The first few days in the house were busy. My dad was over a lot, helping me move in furniture, hang pictures, and set up the place. He's always been handy, and I appreciated the help. A week or so after moving in, I was mostly settled, just finishing up small decorating details. I was starting to get used to living alone. Or so I thought. It was a Sunday night, a night that started out like any other. I had a little trouble winding down though. I've never been a great sleeper, probably inherited that from my dad, so I took a melatonin and a sleeping pill to help. Usually, when I take those, I'm out for the night. I wasn't expecting to wake up until morning, so when I was suddenly pulled from sleep in the middle of the night, I was completely disoriented. At first, I couldn't figure out why I'd woken up. I was in that dazed, confused state, trying to shake off the remnants of a vivid dream. Then I heard it, a sound that felt too familiar to be real, footsteps on the stairs. I lay there for a second, listening, feeling my heart start to race. I remember thinking, that's just Dad. It was automatic, like I'd been conditioned after years of waking up to the sound of him pacing up and down the stairs. I almost tried to go back to sleep, thinking I'd deal with it in the morning. But then it hit me. Dad's not here. You're alone. I shot up in bed, the fog in my head clearing as reality set in. The footsteps had stopped. The house was silent again, but the quiet felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. For a second, I convinced myself that maybe I'd imagined it. I'd heard about people having auditory hallucinations right after waking up, like your brain playing tricks on you. I called out softly, "Dad?" My voice was weak, not because I thought he was actually there, but because I needed to hear myself say something. The silence that followed made my stomach twist. I got out of bed, my feet feeling heavy as they hit the cold floor, and opened the door to my room. The hallway outside was dark, but I felt an overwhelming urge to turn on every light in the house. I crept down the hallway, flipping on switches, feeling slightly ridiculous but not caring. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was shaking. That's when I saw him. A man. A tall man, standing at the bottom of the stairs, wearing a mask. He was looking up at me, perfectly still. For a split second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain couldn't catch up with the fact that there was a stranger in my house, in the middle of the night. It felt like a dream, a nightmare, really. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to move, to say something, to do something. My voice came out of nowhere, a shaky yell that surprised even me. "Get the hell out of my house!" I screamed, my voice cracking as I pointed toward the door. I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified, but I didn't see any weapons, and something about the way he stood there, motionless, made me think, maybe hope, that he wasn't planning on hurting me. To my disbelief, he turned around and walked toward the front door. Just like that. Like he'd decided this was no longer worth his time. I don't know what came over me, but I rushed down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, and locked the door behind him. I thought I was safe for a second. I grabbed my phone to call my dad, because I wasn't thinking clearly, and he was always the first person I called when something went wrong. But before I could dial, I heard another sound. The back door. It slammed shut. There was a second person. Someone else had been in the house. I felt like my blood turned to ice. I was shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. My dad picked up immediately, asking why I was calling him in the middle of the night. When I stammered out what had happened, he yelled at me to call the police. It hadn't even crossed my mind. I hung up and dialed 911, my hands trembling. When the police arrived, I was still in shock. They asked me all kinds of questions, what the men looked like, what direction they went, if they had taken anything. I felt useless. I hadn't seen anything except the tall man at the stairs. I didn't even know there was a second person until I heard that back door slam. The officers looked around but didn't find much. The intruders had come in through a window in the kitchen, one I hadn't thought to lock yet. They didn't seem to have stolen anything, at least nothing I noticed right away. But they'd been in my house, walking around, while I was asleep upstairs. That's the part one can't shake. They were in my home, moving quietly enough not to wake me until the very end. Now every night I sleep with a knife next to my bed, and I don't know when, or if, that feeling of safety will ever come back. I never thought much about small-town life before Jenna and I decided to settle down in Waycross, Georgia. We had been together for nearly 10 years and tied the knot 2 years ago, but it wasn't until we found this place that everything started falling into place. The idea of starting a family, getting a dog, and living in a quiet, peaceful home was everything we had dreamed of. The house we found was perfect, quaint, 2 stories, nestled at the end of a long, quiet road. It sat on a large piece of land, bordering a dense forest. The thought of being surrounded by nature was calming. When we moved in, we felt like we were finally stepping into the next phase of our lives. The house had character, a sort of old charm with wooden floors that creaked just enough to remind you it had seen many years go by. The forest at the edge of the backyard gave it a sense of privacy, and at night, we could hear the crickets and the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful. Or so we thought. That first night, the night when everything started, it was a Monday. We'd been in the house for less than a month, and we were still unpacking, getting used to the new space. It was late, maybe 11:30 p.m., and we were in bed, trying to drift off to sleep. Jenna was already half asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I was just about to nod off myself when I heard it. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but there. Music. I lay there listening. At first I thought maybe it was coming from inside the house. Maybe one of the boxes had a radio or something left on. But no. It was definitely coming from outside. I nudged Jenna awake, and she groaned, rolling over to face me. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She blinked a few times, obviously confused, but then she heard it too. Her eyes widened slightly, and she sat up, listening intently. The music was old, like really old. I couldn't place the song exactly, but it sounded like something from the 1940s. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and walked to the window. When I opened it, the sound became clearer, louder. It was a scratchy recording of "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" The whimsical tune, under different circumstances, might have seemed innocent, even playful. But in the quiet of the night, with no apparent source, it sent a chill down my spine. "Where's that coming from?" Jenna asked, her voice a little shaky. I didn't have an answer. I scanned the backyard but didn't see anything. The music seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper, further back, maybe from the woods. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and told Jenna to stay inside while I went to check it out. The air outside was cooler than I expected, and everything was eerily still. As I stepped off the porch, the music grew louder, echoing through the trees. I shined the flashlight toward the woods, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. I stopped at the edge of the yard and listened. The music was definitely coming from the woods, but the more I strained to hear, the more it felt off. Like it wasn't just coming from one direction but from all around me, surrounding me. I stood there for a while, debating whether to venture into the trees. Something in my gut told me it was a bad idea, that I should turn around and go back inside. Eventually, I did just that, convincing myself it was probably some kids playing a prank, maybe trying to scare the new couple in town. Jenna agreed, though neither of us really believed it. We locked the doors and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. That song, that haunting little melody, stayed with me long after the music itself had faded away. The next night, it happened again. This time, the song was different. "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." A creepy little tune, especially in the dead of night. I was ready to ignore it, to chalk it up to more kids messing around, but then Jenna noticed something. From the window, she spotted something small and dark lying in the middle of the backyard. "Go check it out," she urged, though I could hear the unease in her voice. Reluctantly, I grabbed the flashlight again and headed outside. As I got closer, I realized it was an old radio. One of those vintage kinds with knobs and a wooden body. It was on, playing the song softly. I bent down and turned it off, feeling a strange sense of dread wash over me. Who had put this here? And why? I picked it up and started back toward the house when I heard Jenna scream from the window. "Run! Run!" Her voice was frantic, filled with pure terror. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw them. 3 figures. Standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the tree line. They weren't moving, just standing there staring. They were too far away to make out any details, but the sight of them, just standing there in the dark, made my blood run cold. They were spaced out, evenly, each about 6 feet apart from the other. No movement. No sound. I don't know what came over me, but I dropped the radio and bolted back to the house. I could hear Jenna sobbing by the time I reached the door, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, all the while keeping my eyes on the window, half expecting the figures to be right outside. But they weren't. When Jenna finally calmed down enough to speak, she told me that the 3 figures had been standing there the whole time, watching me as I approached the radio. She said they hadn't moved an inch, not even when I turned to run. They just stood there. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in the living room, huddled together, every creak of the house making us jump. I kept the lights on, and every now and then, I'd peek out the window, expecting to see those figures again. But they were gone. At least I hoped they were. The next morning, we called the police. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something was definitely wrong. The officer who came by didn't seem overly concerned. He took the radio as evidence, and said he'd patrol the area for a few nights, just in case. But that wasn't enough to ease our minds. The figures. The music. The radio. It all felt too deliberate, too sinister. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. We didn't know what they wanted, but we were scared to find out. After that second night, Jenna and I were on edge constantly. Every little sound in the house felt amplified. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves outside sent our nerves into overdrive. We tried to go about our daily routines as normally as possible, but the unease was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It didn't help that the police never found anything suspicious. The radio was old, rusted, something they said was likely left behind by squatters or scavengers. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. There was no way this was just random. No way those figures, standing so perfectly still in the woods, were just some prank or coincidence. I remember about a week passed, and things seemed to calm down. No more music. No strange figures at the tree line. It almost felt like whatever was happening had passed. We were cautious, yes, but with time, we started to breathe a little easier. Jenna suggested we start decorating, getting the house to feel more like a home. She thought it would help, and in a way it did. We hung up some pictures, bought a few new pieces of furniture, and for a little while, the house felt lighter, like it was ours again. But then, that Friday night, it all came crashing down. It was late again, around 1 a.m. Jenna and I had fallen asleep on the couch, watching some mindless TV show to distract ourselves. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels unnaturally calm, like the air itself was holding its breath. I remember waking up suddenly, a sharp chill running down my spine, and I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. That same eerie music from before. This time it was playing louder than ever, piercing through the silence of the night like a knife. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Jenna stirred beside me, rubbing her eyes. "What is it?" she asked groggily. I didn't even need to answer. The look on my face must have told her everything, because her eyes widened, and she immediately understood. The music was back. But this time, It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from inside the house. I jumped to my feet, my pulse racing. The sound was coming from the hallway, near the back of the house. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the noise, my hands shaking. Jenna followed closely behind, clutching my arm. We stopped just outside the door to the basement. The music was louder here, echoing up from below. "No," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "No way." I tried to steel myself, but the fear was overwhelming. I reached for the basement door, hesitating for a moment before turning the knob. It creaked open slowly, revealing the dark staircase leading down into the blackness below. The music, now unmistakably, "Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?" again, echoed from somewhere deep in the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Who or what had gotten into our house? And how? I glanced at Jenna, who shook her head vehemently. "Don't go down there!" But we couldn't ignore it. I had to see. Taking a deep breath, I flicked on the flashlight and started descending the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was damp, cold, and the smell of earth filled my nose. I could feel Jenna's presence behind me, her grip on my arm growing tighter with every step. When we reached the bottom, the light from the flashlight fell on an old, dusty radio sitting in the middle of the concrete floor. It was just like the one from the yard, vintage and worn, its wooden body covered in grime. The music played softly, scratchy but unmistakable. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my ears. The radio looked ancient, older than anything we had ever seen in the house before. I reached down to turn it off when the temperature in the basement dropped sharply. It was like walking into a freezer, the sudden cold so intense that my breath came out in visible puffs. Then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, movement, just barely visible in the darkness. I whipped the flashlight toward it, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures. Standing in the far corner of the basement, shrouded in shadow. They were the same as before, motionless, spaced evenly apart, staring. I couldn't see their faces, just a vague outline of their bodies, but I could feel their gaze. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But my legs felt like they were frozen in place. Jenna gasped, and that seemed to break the spell. I grabbed her hand, yanking her toward the stairs. We scrambled up the steps, slamming the door behind us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. For a moment, we just stood there, panting, our backs pressed against the door. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us knew what to say. The next few hours passed in a blur. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, barricading the door with a dresser. Jenna was in shock, pale and trembling, and I wasn't much better. We didn't call the police this time. I don't know why. Maybe because deep down, I knew they couldn't help us. Whatever this was, it wasn't something they could solve with a few questions and a patrol car. This was something else. Something darker. The next morning, we decided to leave. We didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to get out of that house, to get away from whatever was haunting us. We packed quickly, throwing clothes and essentials into suitcases. Every noise, every creak of the floor, made us jump. By midday, we were on the road, heading to Jenna's parents' house in Atlanta. Neither of us said much during the drive. There was nothing to say. We didn't know what we had just experienced, and we didn't want to dwell on it. For a few days, things were quiet. We stayed with Jenna's parents, trying to pretend everything was fine, but the unease never left us. We avoided talking about the house, the figures, the radio. But we both knew it wasn't over. Not really. I had always dreamed of living on my own, away from the prying eyes and incessant chatter of my family. So, when I finally saved enough money to buy a modest house in the outskirts of Cedar Grove, I jumped at the opportunity. The house, a quaint 2-story structure with peeling blue paint and a yard overgrown with weeds, was far from perfect, but it had character. To me, it represented freedom and independence. I couldn't wait to escape the confines of my childhood home. The first night I spent there was surreal. After hours of unpacking boxes, I sat on the creaky wooden floor of the living room, surrounded by a sea of cardboard and chaos. I looked around at the dusty old furniture I had inherited from the previous owner and sighed. It was a long way from the modern comforts I was used to, but it was mine. I thought about how my friends would be jealous of my new place, and how I would finally be able to throw those wild parties I had always dreamed of. As night fell, the house settled into a profound silence. The creaks of the floorboards and the whispers of the wind outside filled the air, creating an eerie ambience that I hadn't anticipated. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of my new surroundings. After a quick shower, I crawled into bed, hoping to fall asleep quickly. But sleep didn't come easily. The shadows danced on the walls, and every small sound seemed amplified. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced with thoughts of what my life would be like in this house. Just as I began to doze off, a loud thud echoed from downstairs. I shot up, my heart racing. I held my breath, straining to listen for any further sounds. Was it just the house settling, or was there something, or someone, downstairs? After a few agonizing moments, I gathered enough courage to grab a flashlight from the side table and ventured down the dark staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, and the shadows seemed to thicken around me. I flicked on the flashlight, its beams slicing through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the hallway ahead. As I reached the bottom, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The living room lay undisturbed, just the way I had left it. I sighed in relief, chalking the noise up to my overactive imagination. Maybe I should have stayed at my parents' house for just a few more nights. Shaking my head, I retreated back to bed, determined to shake off the jitters. In the following days, I fell into a comfortable routine. I went to work, returned home, and spent my evenings unpacking and decorating. I painted the walls a warm beige and filled the rooms with mismatched furniture I had found at garage sales. However, as the weeks passed, I began to feel an unsettling presence in the house. At first, it was little things. I would leave my phone on the kitchen counter only to find it in the living room an hour later. I shrugged it off, blaming my forgetfulness. But then things escalated. One night, while I was watching TV, I caught a glimpse of something moving outside my window. I jumped up and peeked through the blinds, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the night. My heart raced again. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Despite my growing anxiety, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. I invited a couple of friends over for dinner one weekend, hoping their presence would drown out the odd feelings I had been experiencing. As we laughed and ate pizza, I found myself momentarily at ease. But later, as the night grew late, they left, and I was once again alone. That night, the unsettling feeling returned with a vengeance. As I settled into bed, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from downstairs. My heart dropped. I was certain I had locked all the doors, but the sound persisted. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. Fear gripped me, and I lay frozen in bed, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Would they think I was overreacting? Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As the operator answered, I heard the tapping stop. I whispered my fears to the dispatcher, who assured me that an officer would be dispatched to my location. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but the lingering dread remained. It felt like an eternity until the officer arrived. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor. I explained everything, from the noises to the eerie feeling of being watched. He conducted a quick sweep of the house, checking all the windows and doors. "You might want to invest in some security cameras," he suggested, eyeing the front yard. "It's not uncommon for houses like this to attract trouble." With his reassurances, I felt a little better, but that night, sleep evaded me once again. I lay awake, straining to hear any sound that might suggest someone was in my house, waiting. The tapping had stopped, but the unease clung to me like a shadow. Days turned into weeks, and my anxiety transformed into paranoia. I avoided going out at night, and kept the curtains drawn during the day, convinced that someone was watching me. I started double-checking all the locks before bed and set up makeshift barriers with furniture, just in case. But nothing prepared me for what I was about to discover. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that the air vent in my bedroom was slightly ajar. I had never thought to check it before, but something compelled me to take a look. I knelt beside it, peering inside, and my stomach twisted in knots. I could see something, a dark shape lurking just beyond my line of sight. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't alone in this house. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I contemplated my next move. I needed to get out of there, to call for help, but my instincts told me to stay quiet. What if the person, whoever it was, heard me? I felt trapped in my own home. My heart pounded in my chest as I quietly grabbed my phone, praying that the figure wouldn't hear me. Just as I was about to dial 911 again, I heard a noise from the vent. It was faint but unmistakable, like a soft whisper calling my name. Ethan! It beckoned. My blood ran cold. I didn't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. The whisper seemed to echo through the walls, wrapping around me like a serpent. Ethan! It called again, drawing closer. I took a deep breath and realized that I needed to think clearly. There was no time for panic. I had to act. The whisper was coming from within the vent, taunting me, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I crept back toward the vent, determined to get a better look. I had to know what was hiding in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I grasped the vent cover and pulled it off with a shaky hand. I peered inside, my heart racing. My flashlight beam illuminated the narrow passage, and that's when I saw it, just beyond the metal grating. A pair of eyes glinted back at me. I staggered backward, my mind racing. Those eyes were wild and desperate, and in that moment, I realized the truth. Someone was living inside my house. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces fell into place. All the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, it had all been him. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as the whisper came again, softer this time. Ethan, you need to let me out. I recoiled, panic flooding my senses. How long had he been there? Had he been watching me all this time? I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. Without thinking, I dashed to the front door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. I needed to get to my car and call the police. I bolted down the driveway, my breath coming in gasps as I fumbled for my keys. Just as I reached the car, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Ethan! Wait! The voice was frantic, almost pleading. I turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, silhouetted by the moonlight. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, stumbling toward me. My instincts kicked in, and I jumped into the car, locking the doors just in time. Please! I didn't mean to scare you. I just need help, he shouted, banging on the window. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear, staring at him through the glass as his face twisted in desperation. I've been living in your basement for months. I swear I didn't want to bother you. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. As I did, the man continued to pound on the window, his voice rising in pitch. Please, you don't understand. I had nowhere to go. I didn't mean any harm. The dispatcher picked up just as the man backed away, looking defeated. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his expression shifting from fear to despair. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted it to be like this. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing against the darkness as they pulled into my driveway. I opened the door slightly, shouting for them to hurry. They quickly assessed the situation and approached the man, who had now slumped against the wall, defeated. He looked like a ghost, pale and worn, his clothes ragged. Step away from the house, one of the officers shouted, raising his flashlight. The man complied, raising his hands in surrender. I'm not here to cause trouble, he pleaded, his voice shaking. I just needed a place to stay. I watched from the safety of my car as the officers cuffed him and led him away. A whirlwind of emotions washed over me: fear, relief, and a strange sense of pity for the man who had been living in my home. He was just a lost soul, seeking shelter in a world that had turned its back on him. Once the situation was under control, one of the officers approached me. "Are you okay, son?" he asked, concern etched on his face. I nodded, though my body trembled from the adrenaline rush. "You did the right thing by calling us. We'll take it from here." As they led the man away, I felt a strange sense of closure, but also a lingering unease. What had I unknowingly welcomed into my home? The thought gnawed at me as I finally stepped out of my car, feeling the chill of the night air seep into my bones. Over the following days, I took stock of my life in Cedar Grove. I felt different somehow, more cautious. I invested in a security system and had the basement thoroughly checked out. It felt surreal to think that someone had been living under my very feet, hidden away, while I went about my daily life. My name is Grant O'Reilly, and for most of my life, I've considered myself a rational man. I'm a 45-year-old architect, grounded in the practicalities of blueprints and building codes. My wife, Celia, and I decided to leave the bustling city of Atlanta behind in search of a quieter life. We wanted a fresh start, a home where we could reconnect with nature and enjoy a slower pace. After months of searching, we finally found a charming old house at the edge of the Chattahoochee National Forest, tucked away from the prying eyes of city dwellers. The house was rustic, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to breathe with history. It had been built in the late 1800s and came with a sprawling yard, filled with wildflowers and towering oak trees. Celia was enchanted. I was simply pleased to have found something affordable in this competitive market. As we moved in, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. Was this move the right decision? Would we truly find the tranquility we were seeking? The first few weeks were blissful. We spent our days unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring the nearby woods. I remember the crisp autumn air, the smell of fallen leaves, and the sound of squirrels chattering as they prepared for winter. But as the days passed, I began to notice something unsettling about our new home. It started with the strange noises. At first, I brushed them off as the house settling or perhaps the wind rustling through the trees. But as night fell, the sounds became more distinct: soft thumps, muffled voices, and sometimes, what felt like footsteps above us, even though we were certain there was no one else in the house. Celia laughed it off, calling it the quirks of an old place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home late. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a shroud of darkness that enveloped the woods. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights swept across the house, illuminating the gnarled branches that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I dismissed it as fatigue. As I entered the house, I noticed something odd. The kitchen door, which I always made sure to lock, was ajar. My heart raced. I called out for Celia, but the house was silent. I approached the door cautiously, peering into the inky blackness of the backyard. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet the unease settled deeper into my gut. I locked the door and tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but that night sleep eluded me. In the following weeks, the noises intensified. I started to hear whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to flutter just outside my consciousness. I confided in Celia, but she remained skeptical. "It's just the wind, Grant," she said gently, rubbing my arm. "You're letting your imagination run wild." Determined to prove her wrong, I began to investigate. I set up a camera in the living room, hoping to capture whatever was causing the disturbances. Night after night, I watched the footage, only to find the same scenes replaying, shadows flickering, the occasional curtain swaying, but nothing definitive. The rational part of me screamed that there had to be a logical explanation, but my instincts told me otherwise. One chilly night in late October, I decided to go for a walk in the woods behind our house. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating the twisted branches and leaves that crunched beneath my feet. As I ventured deeper, I stumbled upon an old stone well, overgrown with weeds. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity getting the better of me, I peered into the darkness. The well seemed endless, and a chill swept through me. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the underbrush behind me. I turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing. "Just a deer," I whispered to myself, trying to calm my racing heart. Still, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I hurried back to the house, feeling the weight of unseen eyes following me. When I got home, I found Celia asleep on the couch, the glow of the TV illuminating her peaceful face. I wrapped a blanket around her and sat down to think. Perhaps I was overreacting. Maybe I simply needed to adjust to this new environment. But as I closed my eyes, the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in the corners of my mind. The next day, I decided to go to the local library to dig into the history of the area. If I could find out more about the land, perhaps I could understand what was happening. I spent hours poring over old maps and records, but much of the information was sparse. The town had been founded in the late 1800s, and like many rural areas, it had its share of legends and ghost stories. But nothing concrete about our home or the land surrounding it. Feeling frustrated, I asked the librarian if she knew anything about the property. She paused, a shadow passing over her face. "There's a rumor," she said, lowering her voice, "that a family lived there long ago who, well, let's just say they had some problems." I pressed for more details, but she simply shook her head. "You should be careful. Sometimes things are better left undisturbed." I left the library with a heavy heart, the woman's words echoing in my mind. What did she mean? Were there dark secrets buried beneath the surface of our beautiful home? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again, clearer this time. They seemed to come from the attic. My heart raced, and I finally decided I needed to confront whatever was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the creaky stairs. The attic was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and boxes of forgotten belongings. I called out, my voice shaking. "Hello? Is anyone up here?" The only answer was the rustling of old papers in the corner. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, revealing an old trunk. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I approached it. The lock was rusted but seemed easy enough to pry open. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs and letters, their edges yellowed with age. As I rifled through them, a sense of dread washed over me. The photos depicted a family, smiling, happy, but as I continued to dig, I stumbled upon something disturbing. There were letters filled with despair, talking about betrayal and fear. One letter described a violent argument, culminating in the phrase, "If he finds out, it will be the end of us all." I felt a chill creep up my spine, and before I could process what I had read, I heard it, a loud bang from downstairs. I dropped the trunk and raced down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I awakened? As I descended the stairs, the shadows of the house seemed to close in around me. The front door stood wide open, swinging slightly in the cool night air. Panic surged through me, and I called out for Celia, my voice echoing through the silence. "Celia! Are you here?" I ran to the living room, but it was empty. I dashed back to the kitchen, looking for any sign of her, but there was nothing. My mind raced. Had she gone out? The thought of her wandering alone in the dark sent a jolt of fear through me. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the towering trees that surrounded our home. The only sound was the rustling leaves and the distant call of an owl. I walked toward the edge of the forest, my heart thumping in my chest. "Celia!" I shouted, but the only answer was the wind. Just then, I heard something, soft, almost like a whisper, coming from the direction of the woods. I hesitated, fear gnawing at my insides, but I knew I had to find her. I moved cautiously toward the sound, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The whisper grew louder, and my skin prickled with apprehension. It was as if the very trees were speaking. I pushed through the underbrush, calling out for her again. "Celia! Where are you?" But the only response was the silence, thick and suffocating. I stumbled upon a small clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. There, I found her, standing still, facing the woods, her back to me. "Celia!" I rushed to her side, relief flooding over me, but that relief was short-lived. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on something in the darkness, her expression vacant. I waved a hand in front of her face, but she didn't react. "Celia, what's wrong? Are you okay?" As if waking from a trance, she slowly turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Grant! I heard them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They were calling me." "What are you talking about?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Who?" "The voices," she replied, her gaze drifting back to the trees. "They wanted me to come closer. They said it's safe." "No! We need to get out of here!" I grabbed her arm and pulled her away, urgency coursing through me. We stumbled back toward the house, and as we reached the porch, I noticed something in the yard, a figure standing at the tree line. I squinted, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, but the figure didn't move. It was just a silhouette against the night, watching us. Fear gripped me, and I pushed Celia inside, slamming the door behind us. "Lock it!" I shouted, and she hurried to comply. We stood in the dim light of the living room, breathless. "What just happened?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. Celia's face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. "I don't know, Grant. It felt like someone was trying to pull me in," she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off an invisible chill. "I couldn't help it." I tried to process everything. The letters in the attic, the voices, and now this figure in the woods, it all felt too connected, too real. "We need to leave this place," I said firmly. "We'll find a hotel or something until we can figure this out." Celia nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "What if it follows us?" she whispered. "What if we can't escape it?" Her words hung heavy in the air. I took a deep breath and glanced out the window. The figure was gone, but the oppressive silence remained. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. "Let's just pack a few things," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. As we gathered our essentials, I glanced around the house, a mixture of anger and sadness swelling inside me. How could this charming home feel like a prison? I remembered the moments of joy we had shared here, the laughter, the peaceful mornings, and now, it was all overshadowed by this growing sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the house was plunged into darkness. "What the?" I exclaimed, fumbling for my phone. The sudden loss of light amplified the shadows, making them dance on the walls. I found my flashlight and switched it on, but the beam felt feeble against the thick darkness. "Grant," Celia's voice trembled. "I don't like this." I know. Let's just get out of here," I urged, feeling the panic rise in my throat. We made our way to the front door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" I tugged at it again, but it was as if something was holding it shut. "Grant, it's locked." "I locked it," Celia said, her voice rising in fear. "Then why won't it open?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my tone. I could feel the walls closing in around us, the house alive with a malevolent energy that I couldn't explain. The whispers returned, swirling around us, their tone menacing and chaotic. I turned to Celia, my mind racing. "We need to break a window," I said. "We can't stay here." Just then, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room. In that brief moment of clarity, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. The family portraits that hung on the walls, faces I had overlooked before, now seemed to be watching us, their expressions twisted in anguish. "We need to go! Now!" I shouted, and without thinking, I hurled my shoulder against the door. It burst open, and we stumbled outside, gasping for air. We ran toward the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. "Get in!" I shouted, urging Celia to hurry. We both jumped into the car, and I fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, not looking back. As we sped down the winding road, I could feel the weight of the house pressing against my back, as if it were trying to pull us back. The whispers faded into the night, but I knew this wasn't over. The terror of that place would haunt me forever. I glanced at Celia, her eyes wide with fear, and I realized that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that we couldn't escape so easily. We drove in silence, the darkness swallowing us whole. I could still feel the echo of the whispers in my mind, and I knew deep down that our journey into the unknown had just begun.